Well, here's an interesting example of convergent evolution. So it turns out that we're starting to apply effectively the same model that Tim and co-workers are applying for, slightly different questions in deeper time and the role of plants and trying to understand plants and paleoclimate. But convergent evolution in talks doesn't mean that any of the talk is plagiarized, and if anyone's followed all the fun in the politics in the US and the Republican National Convention, I can assure you now that none of this talk, nothing I'll say, has been said by Twilight Sparkle from My Little Pony. Anyway, so that was Melinda Trump's speech. Apparently, the excuse was. The evolution of plants. I like the phrasing of the importance of evolution. That actually, who cares about metazoans and animals, and really like all the fun things and the big steps are all in plants, both in the ocean and on land. The importance is things like the jumps in the rises of atmospheric oxygen and the oxidation state of the Earth's surface, and also to do with the regulate. Like a big question is what is the role of plants in helping regulate climate? There is the classic sort of little. If anyone's as a modeler, your first model must have been Daisy World, I hope. So there are some classic little conceptual homeostatic models to think about how. It's sort of like an unknowing interaction between sort of life and the planet and climate might lead to some sort of like regulatory feedbacks. But you sort of like look at sort of records of climate or records of compilations of atmospheric CO2, and the Earth doesn't seem that regulated. You might ask the question, do plants help regulate the Earth system? That's the sort of Daisy World, this idea that the greater complexity of life on Earth leads to much better regulation. Or do plants and evolutionary steps and things lead to, do they provide also a destabilizing influence? And when you get destabilization and when you get stabilization, you go back into the sort of Neoproterozoic and the Precambrian, you get huge swings, it seems, in climate and sort of global scale glaciations and things. You might wonder whether there are actually strong regulatory feedbacks at all. We a lot of this meeting, or some of this meeting, and one of the key things people are thinking about in terms of the role of plants is silicate weathering. The silicate weathering feedback, this amazing feedback that helps stabilize the climate. And well, we're assuming that it exists. You can argue that something like that must exist. So here's a little cartoon of the global carbon cycle. It seems like current emissions are about 10 petagrams of carbon a year. The natural leaks from the interior of the Earth are of the order of 0.1, so 1%. So it seems that sort of things coming out of these very, very large rock reservoirs of carbon, they're very, very, very small fluxes compared with the cycling of carbon naturally and also compared with the sort of perturbation we're making today. So you might think, well, does it matter if there's no regulation? If there are slight imbalances in CO2 leaking out or slight imbalances in consumption, does it really matter? You can plot some really awful things in MATLAB to illustrate this. Let's not worry about alkalinity, which is really just the difference between conservative cations and anions in the ocean. On this axis is the total carbon in the ocean and atmosphere in a little box model. And we're only really going to worry about something going vertically, which is just the addition of CO2. I'm just going to really add CO2 in this little model and repartition it at equilibrium between atmosphere and ocean and just see what happens to atmospheric CO2. How much CO2 can the ocean absorb before atmospheric CO2 starts climbing up and up and up. These contours are in multipliers of the partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere today. So times 1 is 278 parts per million in the atmosphere. Times 10 is 2,780 parts per million in the atmosphere. So 10 times modern CO2 and times 100. And the point is, on geological timescales, you don't need very much imbalance. This is an argument made sort of way back by Bob Berner and Kel Kadira. You don't really need much imbalance for atmospheric CO2 to go absolutely nuts, have hugely wild swings. So you can get up to here, which is approaching 100 times modern atmospheric CO2 with, for 1 million years, an imbalance of 0.1. So that's simply doubling the natural volcanic flux, which is small. It's 1% of current CO2 emissions. or you could have for over 10 million years like a 0.1, percent change compared with modern CO2 emissions. So, it seems that we need a negative feedback, but I mean, just because we think we need one doesn't mean that we have one. I'll skip over this. We've seen, so in the convergent evolution of the talks, we've had a number of talks dealing with silicate weathering. So let's, and it's at least the simplest way to think about it is higher atmospheric CO2 driving a warmer climate, which drives faster reaction rates. And I'll come to talk a little bit about then the complexities of the other factors that are involved. So one thing we can start to do is think about what are the signatures of the silicate weathering feedback, if it exists, and then later on we can start to worry about the role of plants and the role of the evolution of different plant forms and plant species. And of course, Gerrit showed some nice data from lithium isotopes and slightly more ambiguous data from the strontium ratios. You can look at a whole variety of geological indicators of something to do perhaps with changes in weathering flux or weathering intensity. But we can also use models to make sort of forward projections of features we might see in the geological record that reflect certain aspects of weathering, or particularly certain aspects of weathering changing. So here is just some very conceptual experiments we played out with an Earth system model, which has a very simple burner-like temperature-only feedback on the rate of silicate weathering. This is really just like a little game you can play in models. This is just throw in as much amount of carbon as you want. In fact, we threw in lots of different amounts of carbon to get an idea of the sensitivity, the response of the different regulatory feedbacks in the Earth system to different amounts of carbon. So here's just like we just ran through. This was 10 or 20 experiments. This is atmospheric CO2 on the y-axis, is the time scale on a log axis going from 1 year to 1 million years. We ran the model out to on the x-axis, and if you throw in CO2 over 1 year, so that's why the jump occurs in 1 year. These are the decays that the model projects for atmospheric CO2 as you go out to 1 million year time scale. So we can sort of plot it up in weird ways again in MATLAB just to upset all the reviewers. Here is timescale, still same timescale, log axis. This is the fraction of CO2 removed. So of the CO2 that was thrown carelessly into the atmosphere at the beginning of the model experiment, this is the fraction that's removed. And what we've done is we go back to these. We've deconvolved these curves into a series of exponential decays to try and get at the different timescales of the processes and separate out the importance of silicate weathering in the evolution of the Earth system in response to a CO2 perturbation. So only to go through these very, very quickly, there is a fast response, which is the initial dissolution of CO2 in the surface ocean. There is a slightly slower response that involves the dissolution of the surface ocean, and also now a time scale of getting up to 1,000 years, which is 10 to the 3 here. As the ocean circulation starts to change, it's a story not worth going into, but the inflection point is probably to do with a response of ocean circulation collapsing in the Atlantic in this particular modern configuration of the Earth system. We actually have information today about where CO2 is dissolving and going, and so, at least on these shorter time scales, the model responses are comparable to or can be tested against observations, which obviously is important. Otherwise, you just have a model which produces fancy numbers, and you have no idea of knowing whether they might have any connection with the real world or not. The longer timescale response involves interactions with carbonates in deep ocean, and also dissolution of carbonates on land. And what's happening in this trend, the blue colors are the smallest CO2 emissions, the yellower colors are the largest CO2 emissions. And what this means is, as we put more CO2 in, more and more CO2 is being removed on a longer and longer time scale by the geological processes, rather than, if I switch back to these, rather than the short-term ocean uptake. So the ocean is becoming less and less efficient in removing the CO2. The geological process is starting to kick in. The whole time scale is becoming longer and longer. In terms of this process, we can look back at ancient events that we're pretty sure involved massive carbon release in the atmosphere. This is an event called the Paleocene, Eocene phylomaximum at about 55 million years ago, just between the boundary of the Paleocene and Eocene. It's sort of like a 5-6 degree sharp transient warming event that looks, then sounds a little bit like what we're doing now, which makes it pretty interesting. You see in the sediments a sudden transition to clay from what was high weight percent, high carbonate weight percent, nanofossil ooze. So, it's a good indicator that at least in terms of this process of reaction of CO2 going into the ocean with carbonates, we're maybe seeing it in the geological record. So, to the silicate weathering, it's something I've not really worked out in my head quite whether it means something really interesting or whether it's a simple consequence that's not so interesting, but it's notable that there are 20 points plotted there in MATLAB. They're all falling basically on top of each other in terms of the time scale that CO2 is, that final fraction of CO2 is removed from the system via enhanced silicate weathering. And the importance is about the same. So there could be something interesting there. This is without, changes in plants or actually any sort of plant function modifying this. And it's this comes to like an important question of do we have, can we see evidence for this then? Not so easily in too much light in the room. This is another sediment core. This is from off Newfoundland. This again goes through the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum boundaries. So back a couple of slides. When we have the initial event, we have this sort of big dissolution of carbonate. Maybe you can see it get whiter, maybe you can't. We're looking for evidence of enhanced silicate weathering, which you'll see as enhanced carbonate preservation, enhanced carbonate burial in the marine geological record. It does go a little bit lighter, so the evidence is starting to come in that maybe we are seeing evidence of enhanced silicate weathering after big carbon release events to the Earth system. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with plants yet. So the world is obviously a little bit more complex than my model, which just has a very simple, globally averaged Bob Burner-like temperature-only dependence of silicate weathering The real world in terms of weathering maybe looks like this. This is actually my garden. There's obviously complex hydrology, and there's plants, and there's different species with different roots, and maybe some mycorrhizal associations, etc., etc. So it's some, as Lila nicely went through, it's not a simple, maybe it's about almost the most complicated. I mean, the climate system, the whole atmospheric response of global temperature to CO2 increase is so simple. It's only physics. It's so simple, I would say, compared with actually getting at the global weathering with plants and all the complexity of soil structure and mineralogy. The hydrology, temperature, and atmospheric CO2, which is also enhanced in the soils due to respiration, and some function of plant productivity, the nature of the plants, the nature of the roots, the nature of the associations, etc., etc. I mean, for the modern, it's not so bad. Again, as Lila pointed out, it's when you go to the Ordovician and things, you just don't have observational data sets that are globally gridded and all nicely resolved. So for modern, obviously, you can get sort of texture and soil depth and lithology, although soil maps are actually not as good as you might think on a global scale. You can obviously get either observational temperature precipitation and/or reanalysis data, or you can just use pure model products. There are satellite products. There are lots of nice, spatially extensive and temporally resolved data sets for modern, and also you can model plant distributions and productivity. There's data. There's all sorts of things you can use. So what about when we go further back, though? So we don't have these observational data sets. Poor lot have to rely on modelers to try and make some sort of sense of this. The models we use in the IPCC look a little bit like this in terms of the land scheme. You have some nice grid for the ocean and atmosphere and lots of lovely physics, which is all solved. And this is the easy bit. So as much as people moan about what climate sensitivity is, this is the really easy bit. So then you have a land surface scheme, which is going to try and do something about soil water holding capacity and how much water you've got, et cetera, et cetera. And then typically what we have, and this is almost generic across all the current generation of CNIP 5 era, AR5 era models, is this thing this way of dividing up the complexity of plant life on land into what are called plant functional types. And typically, they're often about 5. At least in this model, this is JULES, which is the UK. I have no idea what JULES stands for. Joint, University, Land Surface, something. So there's broadleaf trees, needleleaf trees, see-through grasses, see-fall grasses, and shrubbery, as in Monty Python. I look at this way of conceptualizing or encoding in a model system as a little bit like, I think of it like the early days of box models of ocean circulation. So we're going back to the 70s as people started to think about carbon cycling and, for instance, how it might have changed between glacial and interglacial. And for instance, you might think, well, the ocean is pretty much a very large, deep box. There is like a slightly deeper high latitude box that mixes deeply, and then there is a low latitude box that's fairly shallow and stratified, and you have some sort of circulation, and you can solve it quite easily, and you can put a carbon cycle in there, you can put some geochemistry, you can put lithium isotopes in here, you can put all sorts of things in here. The danger with this sort of thing is you basically tell it the answer. You have to really know the key features of the ocean and how they work to make a model like that, which is sort of what you're doing here, which is maybe all right if you're only doing sort of near future things. But it's a bit different when you want to go back in time. I mean, obviously, if you go back far enough, we don't have any plants on land, so maybe that's a little bit trivial, so you don't apply these models back there. Well, you don't apply them for any of this if you have C4 grasses. Well, so I guess they evolved earlier on, but they're not really doing very much until the Miocene. So if you want to do anything back here with these are our best tools for climate and global carbon cycling and things. If you want to use one of our best quote unquote tools, you have to get rid of one of the 5 functional types already to really think about sort of earlier in the Phanerozoic. And in fact, typically what people do is they just do it either with bare soil or just grasses, because what do you really know about are these plants, are these things if you conceptualize as a modern needleleaf tree, these are going to be boreal generally. The picture I had was, it's wet then because it was the one day it rains and it was El Nino, but it doesn't rain for 6 months a year in the mountains, and these boreal needleleaf trees, these are ponderosa pine and things, these are rooting to about 10 or 20 meters because that's where the water is, and there's no one else around to bother them apart from wildfires. And but your typical plant functional type isn't even going to do the details of spatial patterns if you look in great detail in the modern system. So what we need, or what we're starting to explore, so I would say from my perspective, I'm just going to show you results that were generated a few days ago. I don't really know what they mean, but they're already actually raising questions. And I think this is almost the nicest thing about models, that when they raise questions, when you get a model result, and if you look at it and you say, I don't understand that, and then you go on to say, there's something not assumed right in that model and we need to rethink it. This is the most valuable thing about models. If you run a model and it does exactly what you thought it would do, why did you run it? You can save yourself years of coding. If you knew the answer, and all the model is going to do is show you the answer, which I worry a little bit about box models. There is a little bit of tendency to get that sort of thing. We've long since don't have 3 boxes for the ocean. Models these days for AR5 it's like a 1-degree grid, so you've got 360 by 180. Often it's maybe 30 levels. This is now, order of 10 to the 5 or 10 to the 6 boxes. It knows a lot about the physics of a fluid of a rotating sphere. You don't tell it the circulation. You let the Earth spin around, and you have drag at the surface, and you have differential heating and P minus E, and a circulation and a complex seasonally varying circulation which interacts with the atmosphere and monsoons and El Nino cycles and things arises out of the fundamental physical behavior of the system. So you don't tell it that you want El Nino and you want a strong El Nino in 92 and you want a strong La Nina in 95 or something. It actually hopefully comes up with these sorts of patterns based on fundamental understanding rather than trying to tell it some sort of answer. So climate modeling has long since ended up with this more free form of the properties of the system emerge rather than get prescribed. It would be nice to do this in plant modeling, in sort of biosphere modeling and understanding how the system evolves through time and therefore how it interacts with the climate system and how it changes weathering and things. It was really interesting to see some of the talks earlier and also yesterday in terms of what are the hard steps and what are the easy steps in evolution. Would you predict them? You know, this whole question of, is something a little bit like we've got here in this room inevitable, or has there been so many unpredictable steps you could never predict and would never happen anywhere near like again that we get something completely different? From a modeling perspective, I mean, trying to model, you can't really model novel innovation. Why would you think that would happen in the model if you didn't know it beforehand? So typically what we would do then to worry about or to address features, you know, for instance, like, you know, how plants modify weathering, you want to divide up this. So this would be a way of dividing up. Don't worry about whether I've got the lines in the right places for major transitions in the sort of nature of the biosphere. But we would have an earlier one, and this is like effectively, although I wasn't here on Monday because I was flying in, this was effectively what Tim was talking about. So you could have a very simple or a very different system and not worry about vascular plants in the Paleozoic. You could maybe make another difference and have two different systems that you basically, I look at this, you're in each of these, you might have a very, very different ecosystem through time within one of these, but you start from the same menu. You know, the buffet is the same. You might pick only the rice if you're stupid, or you might pick some juicier things, but the buffet's all there. All the genetic, all the metabolic, you know, menu is laid out on the table. You pick what you want, whereas, you know, not all the metabolic menu is available. So you can't pick everything here. So you can sort of divide the system up. So funnily enough, convergently, we're using effectively the same model, but this is the vascular plant version of this sort of emergent property ecosystem model. It's sort of just, I like it conceptually because it makes sense with a plant that if you have so much photosynthetic product, you can make longer leaves or deeper roots or a higher stem or more seeds, or you could try and grow faster, or you can try this or that or whatever. It provides a natural trade-off. You know, you've got so much carbon fixed, there is going to be so much metabolic cost of having particularly large leaves. You could start to put structural constraints on this and think that even if you had, you know, the fixed carbon to make a 400-foot long leaf, then you could start to think of some basic mechanics, and particularly in high winds, you wouldn't want a 400-foot long leaf. So I like plants are quite amenable to some sort of almost mechanistic sort of conceptualization of what a generic plant might be, which is a bit different from phytoplankton, where we're also trying to create ecosystem models that have emergent properties and emergent diversity. It's less easy to define the trade-offs, or rather, the trade-offs become much more subjective in a marine ecosystem model than something as simple as if you put all your carbon into a leaf, you have no roots. That's pretty simple. Anyway, so we've been just starting to apply it to, we're actually sort of doing it, so shallow time, so actually they're nothing to do with the subject of the meeting, but it is an approach which, if Tim's already shown you that he's using back here, it's an approach that might be a useful way of coming up with a model that's trying to make fewer assumptions than you might otherwise be making, because the fewer assumptions you make, the more chance you have to learn something, and the more chance maybe to get it right. So we're looking at the earliest Eocene. Basically, we're taking this trait-based model that has 10,000 randomly generated possible plants or possible plant strategies. We're applying it with a climate model output of temperature and precipitation, PMIC and things. This is what we get. You always start with the modern. So if anyone ever shows you a model that they jump straight into deep time, then that's bad. You need to be sure at least that it's not doing something insane for the modern. So this is Net primary productivity for the modern, I don't have the data because I don't have time. You can derive all sorts of things from the traits. So there are 10. The problem becomes when you have 10,000 species is how do you visualize that? How do you relate that to modern? When you have the functional type-based model, needleleaf, broadleaf, C3, C4 shrubbery, then you have nice maps of these biomes. The model is basically designed to fit the data or to be able to directly relate to the data. Whereas if you have 10,000 possible things, you have to think quite creatively of how to group these and aggregate these and relate these to the data. It's not so easy even for modern when you have lots of data, and it's become more interesting going back into deeper time where you have a little bit of information, say from the Arctic, about sort of monkey puzzle-like trees and whatever. So this is our first. I was emailed this Tuesday, and then the person who generated it went on holiday, so that wasn't so convenient. And then anyway, so we go to, I can't even pronounce, this is the earliest Eocene stage. This is driven with 8 times CO2 climate, so warm climate. So the Southern Ocean is probably about 10, 25 degrees in the model. I don't have the model plot to hand. It's a warm climate, but in this initial run, atmospheric CO2 is kept basically at modern. So this is already interesting because there's almost no primary productivity on Earth. And it's like, well, that's not what we see in the Eocene. So this turns out to be, well, I don't know the details, there is this quantum yield thing. You have this shaped curve. As a function of temperature, it has a temperature optima. This temperature optima gets higher as you go to higher CO2. But if you have a very warm climate at low CO2, then you effectively, it's where the curve crashes down and you have very little photosynthetic efficiency. And whether that's then applicable as the further you go back in time then raises interesting questions. So actually when you start thinking about it, even though this model doesn't really make any assumptions about modern biomes, it's based on every empirical thing that's ever been done about modern plants. And some of those may be generically applicable as far back as you'd like to go, and some of these may not be generically applicable, which makes it actually a bit of a challenge to know which of the parameterizations that people have laboriously and cleverly done laboratory experiments on today on modern plants, and we've generally always made these models for the next 100 years. People don't generally make these models thinking it'll be exactly applicable to the Ordovician or exactly applicable to the Siluria, and they're making these models for modern, and then we're adapting them, and it raises interesting questions. How much do we have to adapt them, and which basic, what we assume are basic physiological responses may not be, I guess, evolutionary, conservative in terms of evolution. If we run this at high CO2, then we actually get modern-like global productivity. So this is because the quantum yield efficiency, whatever it is, the temperature optima moves higher under higher CO2, and we get a reasonable pattern. So this is actually as far as we got. So if the abstract said fun results, you've got to, that's fun. So you got to, that's as fun as I model. That's as fun as it gets. Anyway, so I think this is an interesting way to go to try and, because of the, again, as Lila very nicely said, it's the spatial. There are hotspots of weathering. The Earth is not flat in one box, and we've for a long time in paleoclimate had the ability to have some sort of spatial simulations of temperature and precipitation and things, at least for a little bit shallower time. We have all sorts of proxies to have some sort of confidence that the models are not nuts. But plants are not just one generic grass or one generic needleleaf tree that they either cover the land at 100% or they cover it at 0%. You've obviously got a complex pattern of plants and a complex pattern of rooting depths and plant trait strategies and things. So I like the emergent thing. So this is the very first results, at least in shallower time, with emergent property ecosystem model, and it doesn't look, it's not insane anyway. I've abandoned the country anyway, so but thanks to the funders, particularly that I applied at the right time before. Anyway.